President William Ruto is asking Gen Z protesters not to burn their country in what appeared to be a departure from his usually abrasive style. The president seemingly implored protesters to become part of the solution, saying they were sending the country down a dangerous path where there would be no country. He blamed the protests on opponents who he said wanted power at all costs. The president termed the protests on Wednesday as calculated chaos and economic sabotage. He was addressing Wednesday's June 25th anniversary protests that resulted in the deaths of more than 15 people, left hundreds injured, and led to the destruction of millions of shillings in property.
Why are the enforcers of the law now its loudest critics? Why are the guardians of the state turning their backs, not on the people, but on the power they once protected? This is not just a protest. This is a rupture in the moral fabric of a nation. In Kenya, it is not the poor who are rioting. It is the police. And while the cameras fixate on the chaos, few are asking the real question: what force could drive the defenders of a system to become its resistors? If this story shakes something in you already, then stay with us, because what you are about to witness may redefine the idea of loyalty, leadership, and liberty in Africa. Let us begin not with speculation, but with the facts, cold, sharp, and unforgettable. On a humid July morning in Nairobi, the streets trembled, not from traffic or celebration, but from boots. Thousands of paramilitary officers marched, not in unison with orders, but in defiance of them. Some tore off their uniforms. Others threw their badges to the ground. For the first time in decades, the very hands that enforced the law refused to bear it any longer. Inflation had soared past 20%. Salaries were delayed, bonuses slashed, and the promise of prosperity sold off in exchange for foreign loans. The Kenyan police, once symbols of state control, now marched as citizens, broken, betrayed, and boiling. Meanwhile, nearly 3,000 miles away in Burkina Faso, a different scene unfolded. President Ibrahim Traoré stood in a dusty village square. No security, no suit, listening. Not commanding, but listening. He had rejected the IMF. He had invited farmers, students, mothers to imagine a new way. In Kenya, the state resisted the people. In Burkina Faso, the people became the state. But how did two nations facing the same crisis choose such opposite destinies? The first sign of collapse is rarely loud. It is not a bang. It is a crack in silence, a fissure in loyalty. In Kenya, that crack came not from revolutionaries, but from those entrusted with repression. When the police, the arm of the state, laid down their shields, the myth of order collapsed with it. What does it mean when the enforcers of power begin to mourn it? Their protest was not choreographed. It did not need slogans. It was a raw cry, unfiltered. We did not betray the country. One officer declared in a viral video, "We refuse to betray ourselves." No scriptwriter could have penned a more damning confession. These were not outsiders. They were the system's inner circle, now turned whistleblowers. Behind the drama stood cold economics. The Kenyan shilling had bled value against the dollar. Inflation pushed bread, fuel, and medicine beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. And when the government accepted $9 billion in IMF loans between 2021 and 2024, it came at the usual cost. Public service cuts, VAT increases, delayed salaries. The equation was cruelly simple to secure foreign approval. The government strangled domestic trust. The police, often seen as untouchable, were not spared. Their allowances disappeared. Their salaries arrived late or not at all. Training programs vanished. Retirement plans evaporated. The irony. The very men trained to suppress protest now found themselves victims of the same policies they once enforced. And so they did what no one expected. They refused to comply. But their defiance was not just economic. It was existential. What is loyalty when leadership is transactional? What is order when justice is no longer just? The protests spread like sparks across dry kindling. Nurses, teachers, civil servants, people who once stood silently behind barricades, now joined the chant, "Enough." But what made it powerful was not its anger. It was its coherence. These were not riots. They were reckonings. People were not simply demanding higher wages. They were asking deeper questions. Why must we pay for the mistakes of those we never elected? Why is sacrifice always asked of the poorest, while immunity is reserved for the powerful? And why do our leaders only speak to us through budget cuts and batons? This was not politics. It was a confrontation between dignity and debt. And yet, amid the swelling unrest, the government chose silence. It did not speak. It instructed. It did not listen. It imposed. The president's televised appeal to Gen Z to not burn their country felt less like a dialogue and more like a warning from above. But the fire had already caught, not in buildings, but in the belief systems of a generation. If you have ever felt like the system is not broken, but deliberately breaking you, this story is not just about Kenya. It is about you. What would you do if the rules you enforced were now used against you? If your badge became your burden, leave your thoughts below. Your truth may be the beginning of someone else's courage. The movement gained a soul when the youth joined in, not with rage, but with refusal. University students began creating digital archives of the country's loan history, translating financial documents into local languages, and hosting open forums on campus lawns. They were not burning institutions. They were exposing them. Civil society groups launched independent review boards, questioning ministers online, demanding transparency, and citing legal codes once weaponized against them. A nation once divided by class, region, and occupation now shared a single sentiment: we were never consulted. And that is the point of fracture. A government can survive poverty. It can survive opposition, but it cannot survive irrelevance. In the shadows of the protest, an officer's voice on local radio offered perhaps the most haunting summary. When we wore this uniform, we believed we were protecting something sacred. But now we only guard silence. In Kenya, silence had become the new enemy. Not instability, not poverty, but the silence of those who ruled without listening, who borrowed without explaining, who punished without warning. And the question echoing through the nation's alleys and airwaves was no longer, will the government respond? It had become, do they even remember we exist? But while Kenya burned with questions, another country whispered answers, in voices that built, not broke. While Kenya echoed with chants and sirens, Burkina Faso moved with a silence that was louder than any megaphone. There were no mass protests, no burning tires, no viral clashes with riot police. And yet something revolutionary was unfolding. Quietly, steadily, irreversibly. In the town of Kaya, a dusty village market had transformed. Where politicians once stood on stages with scripted promises, President Ibrahim Traoré now sat cross-legged on a straw mat listening, not performing, listening. No armored vehicles, no podiums, just presence. It was not a campaign stop. It was a conversation. He had rejected the IF, not with defiance, but with conviction. We do not need loan conditions, he said. We need living conditions. With those words, he flipped the development script, a script written in foreign capitals, not African classrooms. He did not offer subsidies. He offered responsibility, and the people responded. University students volunteered to tutor children in rural villages. Women formed collectives to bake local bread, replacing imported wheat. Farmers began using homemade bio-fertilizers guided not by state programs, but by radio lessons created by fellow villagers. None of this was decreed from above. It rose from below. In Ouagadougou, architecture students designed low-cost homes from pressed clay. In Bobodia-Lasso, electricians repaired broken solar grids with scrap metals and community tools. And in the hills outside Tenkadogo, teachers who had not been paid in months returned to classrooms anyway, because the children had not stopped showing up. No government official ordered this, but none stood in the way. This was not obedience. It was ownership. Burkina Faso was not becoming a utopia. It still faced poverty, insecurity, and economic isolation. But unlike many nations, it did not outsource its dignity. The revolution was not being televised, but it was being lived in small acts of contribution, in whispered conversations under mango trees, in notebooks shared between brothers and sisters who believed that change was not something one waits for, but something one begins. And this, perhaps, is where Traore's leadership diverged most dramatically. He did not speak of miracles. He spoke of soil, of sweat, of sacrifice. He asked his people what they could give, not what they could receive. And because he asked with humility, not command, they answered. Have you ever believed in something not because it promised riches, but because it demanded your effort? If so, you may understand why Burkina Faso is not rising through revolt, but through responsibility. If that stirs something in you, tell us what you would give, not take, for the place you call home. At community forums, Traore asked villagers, if you were president, what would you cut to protect schools? How much land would you donate for food programs? How would you guard your community from imported dependency? These were not rhetorical flourishes. They were frameworks. And slowly, those frameworks took root. Local committees sprung up, not to protest corruption, but to coordinate harvests. Retired engineers started weekend labs to teach children how to repair water pumps. Mothers began organizing nutrition circles based not on supplements, but on ancestral diets. Education became a shared mission. Infrastructure became a neighborhood project. And politics became something rare in the post-colonial African context, participatory. What made this remarkable was not its scale, but its spontaneity. There was no central planning. There were no foreign consultants. Just citizens stepping into civic life because they felt seen, not just governed. And the world watched, but did not understand, because this did not fit the narrative of African dependence, African dysfunction. It was not chaos. It was coherence. So when international media ran headlines warning of Burkina Faso instability, locals laughed. Instability. They were planting gardens. They were fixing roofs. They were teaching algebra. What exactly was unstable? The truth, of course, is that stability threatens those who rely on dysfunction to justify control. Burkina Faso was not rejecting the global order. It was simply rewriting its local one. This is the paradox that rattled elites across oceans, a country considered poor, failing, and fragile, choosing to solve its crisis not with capital injections or policy blueprints, but with trust. Trust in people, trust in purpose. And trust, unlike currency, is not borrowed, it is earned. But if trust built one nation from the ground up, what happens when trust vanishes from the heart of another? Two Africas now stand before us, not North and South, not Francophone and Anglophone, but the Africa of despair and the Africa of determination. Kenya and Burkina Faso are not just two countries. They are two answers to the same question. What happens when a nation is pushed to the edge? In Kenya, the answer came in the form of rebellion, not of the poor, but of the powerful. Police officers, once arbiters of order, now marched in rage. Civil servants filed out of ministries. Nurses walked out of hospitals, and university students began dismantling the myths of reform with nothing but laptops and curiosity. It was a rupture, deep, loud, and brave. But in Burkina Faso, the answer came differently. Not in protest, but in participation. Not in collapse, but in quiet construction. There were no mass resignations, no walkouts. Instead, there was a walk-in, to classrooms, to fields, to neighbors' homes, to town halls. People walked in with empty hands and walked out with plans. Kenya burned to demand attention. Burkina Faso built to claim it. Both were cries for justice, but one was a scream, the other a whisper, and yet which voice carried further? It is tempting to reduce these stories to policies. One rejected the IMF, one embraced it, one cut salaries, the other built trust. But this contrast runs deeper than budget lines. The difference is not in numbers. It is in leadership. In Kenya, the leader speaks from a palace. In Burkina Faso, the leader sits on the ground. In Kenya, orders are issued from above. In Burkina Faso, questions are posed from below. One governs with instructions. The other governs with presence. Because in moments of national pain, people do not seek perfection. They seek participation. And when the system refuses to look into their eyes, they will break the mirror. In Kenya, trust was forfeited, traded for loans, for short-term solvency, for appeasement of global institutions. In Burkina Faso, trust was built, brick by brick, with nothing more than listening, transparency, and sweat, which one endures. History has shown a government can survive poverty. It can survive sanctions. It can even survive opposition. But no government survives the loss of its moral authority. In this moment, Africa stands at a crossroads not of economics, but of ethics. The question is no longer whether we need reforms. The question is who defines them, and for whom. If you were asked today, not what you want to receive from your country, but what you are willing to give, what would your answer be? Not in money, not in protest, but in effort, in honesty, in trust. Leave a comment not to agree or disagree, but to declare what kind of Africa you believe in. This is not about choosing Traore or Ruto. It is about choosing a model of leadership, one that fears its people, or one that walks among them, one that begs for foreign rescue, or one that dares to build from within. In many African nations, the idea of power has been reversed. It no longer means service. It means escape. Leaders rise not to lead, but to leave poverty behind, to leave history unhealed, to leave the people unheard. But the people are beginning to stay. They are staying in the fields, in the classrooms, in the conversations. They are realizing that nation building does not begin in parliament. It begins in the heart, in the hands, in the homes. This is the real awakening. Not viral clips or fiery speeches, but a quiet, collective return to responsibility, where the flag means something again, where the leader is not a distant shadow, but a shared mirror. The irony is that both Kenya and Burkina Faso face the same crisis: inflation, debt, disillusionment. But one treats its people as children, the other as citizens. And in that choice, the future of a continent is being shaped. So ask yourself, if a leader must borrow trust from abroad, what has he lost at home? If a government fears transparency, what truth is it hiding? If progress comes only from policy, where is the soul of the nation? But just as the world began to draw these lines in confidence, history pulled its favorite trick, a sudden turn that changed everything. Just when the world thought it had grasped the storyline, one of rebellion in Kenya, resilience in Burkina Faso, the narrative shifted, not with riots, not with bloodshed, but with pencils, blackboards, and the quiet rustle of notebooks. The world had begun to take note of Traore's defiance. Headlines warned of instability. Credit agencies downgraded ratings. Investment halted. And yet, it was not Burkina Faso's banks that suffered first. It was its classrooms. International education foundations began pulling support. Research grants were suspended. University exchanges were canceled. The stated reason: Burkina Faso's academic model no longer aligns with international standards. But the people knew this was not about standards. It was about silence. If you cannot stop a revolution in the streets, you try to stop it in the minds. And so, for the first time in recent history, education became a battlefield, not of ideology, but of sovereignty. But then something remarkable happened. Students did not scatter. They reorganized. Professors did not protest. They volunteered. Farmers, traders, mechanics, those who had never entered university gates, stepped in to teach what no imported textbook ever could: practical wisdom, ancestral knowledge, survival skills rooted in soil and memory. In Awakens, senior engineering students created a mentorship circle, teaching underclassmen without pay. In Kidogo, parents formed weekend learning hubs, sharing knowledge of agriculture, trade, and local governance. And in the capital, volunteer collectives began writing new curricula, not to mimic Europe, but to rediscover Africa. Education had ceased to be a privilege. It had become an uprising. No longer bound by bureaucracies or foreign evaluations, learning became an act of liberation. And in this strange, unexpected reversal, the chalk became sharper than any sword. What is more powerful than $1 billion loan? A grandmother teaching her grandson to plant cassava without fertilizers. A teenager teaching coding in his native language. A nation that learns because it refuses to forget. Across the border, this movement sparked new conversations. In Kenya, youth forums no longer asked for scholarships. They asked why they were waiting for them. If Burkina Faso could teach itself with no budget, what were they waiting for? The protest signs began to change. Our minds are not for sale. We will not be graded by the world's fears. This was the twist. Not a military coup, not a revolution of fists, but the return of agency through education. Education not as compliance, but as defiance. Have you ever considered that the most dangerous citizen is not the armed one, but the informed one? Would you fight for the right to think freely, even when no one sees it as a fight? If so, what would you teach? If tomorrow no books arrived, but the truth still mattered, in a continent long dismissed as dependent, a new kind of independence was being born. Not loud, not televised, but real. And as the final page of this story turns, a question remains: what will you pass on? Fear or freedom? One day the cameras will turn away, the headlines will fade, the credit ratings will rise again. But what remains is not the noise, it is the choice. In Kenya, a police officer removed his badge to reclaim his dignity. In Burkina Faso, a grandmother taught arithmetic under a mango tree. Both acts, though worlds apart, declared the same truth: we will not wait to be saved. Because in the end, nations are not saved by aid. They are saved by memory, by those who remember what justice feels like, what dignity looks like, what it means to lead without fear. So ask yourself, if tomorrow no one gave you permission to build your future, would you still build it? If the system forgets you, will you forget yourself? If these stories moved you, then do not let them end here. Share your thoughts. Join the voices. Subscribe not to a channel, but to a cause. Because this is not the end of a video. This is the beginning of a generation. The question is no longer, who will save Africa? The question is, will you be one of those who does?